Hello everyone, welcome back to our second lecture on our Clash of Cultures series. Last time we took a look at the establishment of the nation of Israel. We saw how it immediately sparked a war with its Arab neighbors and how Israel was victorious in that war. This would not be the last war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In fact, that is going to be our primary discussion today. We're going to look at some of the conflicts that happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and we're going to basically see the history of these clashes between Israel and its Arab neighbors, as well as some of the internal clashes that have happened. We're going to see the roots here of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. Last time we talked about how the Palestinians that were located within what became Israel basically were pushed into narrower and narrower parts of that country, and as you can imagine, over the decades their conditions have worsened. So we'll go ahead and get started with our notes here. Let's take a look at the first war up, and that is in 1956. We're looking at the Suez War, the Suez conflict. Now, this one involved Israel, but it wasn't the root of the conflict. West of Israel, you had the nation of Egypt, and Egypt lay close to, well, it basically controlled the land surrounding the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal is one of the most amazing engineering feats in human history, but it's also one of the most valuable because what the Suez Canal did was it effectively made a canal between the Mediterranean Ocean and the Red Sea, which connected to the Indian Ocean. This today is one of the most heavily trafficked canals in the world. In fact, a vast majority of our goods flows through the Suez Canal, and as you can imagine, whoever controls that canal is going to stand to make a lot of money. So basically what happened was in 1957, Egypt nationalized it, meaning that it took control. The government said, we own this now. Now, the Western nations, especially the United Kingdom and France and Israel, who is starting to align themselves a little bit more with some Western nations, in particular France at this time, those three nations make a secret pact to retake the canal from Egypt. They were concerned that with the Egyptian control of the Suez, that they would basically close off trade to Western nations, that they would basically limit the flow of goods. So in 1956, these three countries launched an invasion to retake the Suez Canal. Now, again, this is in the middle of the Cold War, and the Cold War had a tendency to take small regional conflicts and to make them flashpoints and turn them into much bigger and perhaps even nuclear incidents. So this is one of those major flashpoints where President Eisenhower had to make a decision quite quickly on how to handle this. Now, eventually, he's going to push the United Nations to get involved, and eventually they do. Now, by the time they get involved, Israel had pushed Egypt all the way back to their own border. In fact, Israel had taken over what you see in this map, the Sinai Peninsula. And even though the UK, France, and Israel had taken control of the Suez, they will agree to leave in 1957, and they will leave control of the Suez Canal in the hands of the United Nations. Now, this was one of the first wars in which we saw Israel, frankly, as the aggressor. And that, as you can imagine, stoked a lot of anger and resentment in the Middle East, and especially that was being voiced by the main kind of rallying figure for Arab nationalism, and that was the Egyptian president, Nasser. Now, Nasser is going to, as I said, try to rally many of the Arab nations around the cultural similarities of those nations, but it was a very anti-Western rhetoric that he will use, also a socialist rhetoric, so we see taking, at least a closer link to the Soviet Union, which also concerned the United States. So basically what you have here is Nasser trying to make a power block out of the Middle East and North Africa and say we don't have to align ourselves with either the U.S. or USSR. We can be powerful on our own. That was kind of one of the reasons that he tried to take the Suez Canal. But we're seeing this relationship sour. Of course, a lot of animosity from Israel and their surrounding neighbors, and the Suez War did not help any of that. Now, in 1964, we're going to see one of the first major organizational movements among the Palestinian people that are still in to what is at this point Israel. They call their organization the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, the idea was to give a voice to the people in Palestine, but it became a very militant group very quickly, and frankly, the U.S. recognized the PLO as a terrorist organization soon after they were founded. And even some of their splintering off groups, the Fatah is going to be an example of one of those. You can see there the Fatah, which still exists. Their goal is the complete liberation of Palestine and the eradication of Zionist economic, political, military, and cultural existence. Yikes, that says a lot there. Now, in 1968, Yasser Arafat is going to take over as the leader of the PLO, and he does advocate guerrilla war. He suggests that the PLO and Palestinians in general fight back against what they see as their Israeli occupiers. And he will become the leader of the Palestinian movement, and frankly, throughout the rest of his life, will be seen as kind of the main voice for the Palestinian people. In 1974, we get a little bit closer. At times throughout the Middle East in recent history, there have been points where we've kind of taken steps towards peace, but we've just never really gotten there. In 1974, he is going to offer a peaceful resolution which called for a binational state in Israel or Palestine. Now, I want to remind you that in our last lecture, we talked about when Israel was established that there had been a plan put in place, the partition of Palestine, in which it would be a binational country, that there would be some land for the Palestinians, there would be some land for the Israelis, and the Israelis were all for that, but the Palestinians were not. Well, now the tables have kind of reversed. Okay? Now the Palestinians are calling for that, but the Israelis control all the land, so why would they agree to give up any of it? Well, either way, Israel basically does not agree to these 10 points, fearing that it would lead to more Palestinian attacks in the future. And really one of the first major opportunities for peace we have between Israel and Palestine, the Israelis walk away from at this point. Now, in 1967, we're going to see, this for Israelis is the big one. This was the big war in which they gained not only a vast amount of territory, but really established Israel as being a powerful country in the Middle East. Syria, Egypt, and Jordan are basically all going to amass their troops right on the border with Israel. Israel felt as if there was an attack coming. They felt, listen, if all these nations are putting their troops right on our border, it's a matter of time. So Israel in 1967 launched a preemptive attack, primarily using their air force, in which they attacked the Arab military that was right at the border. And over the course of 6 days, they obliterated the Arab military surrounding them. As a result, they will regain the Sinai Peninsula. They will fully take over the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, which they take from Jordan. And they also guarantee access to one of the holiest sites in both Judaism and Islam and Christianity, and that is Jerusalem. Okay, now in Jerusalem, you have the remnants of the original temple that the Jewish people, again, well, I guess the second temple, but that the Jewish people were kicked out of by the Romans. There is one wall that still stands from that original temple, and it is called the Western Wall. Sometimes it's referred to as the Wailing Wall. That's kind of a dated term, but the Western Wall is quite literally the Western Wall of the temple that existed in ancient times. Today, it is the most important of all Jewish sites. You will see people today, approach the wall and pray there. In fact, they'll even write little prayers on pieces of paper and slip them in the cracks of the wall. This is one of, if not the holiest site in all of Judaism. They did not have access to this part of Jerusalem until the 6-Day War. And so that is one reason this war is so big to the Israelis, because they finally gain access to it at this point. Now, the Arab nations are starting to become a little bit frustrated by the fact that they are unable to defeat the Israelis. And what we see in the 1970s is frankly a rise of extremism in how to handle Israel. In 1972, in one of the worst terrorist incidences, not necessarily in terms of loss of life, but just in terms of just terrible events, in 1972, the Olympics had returned to Germany for the first time since World War II. It was at those Olympics that were being held in Munich that Palestinian terrorists took hostage 11 members of the Israeli sports teams, and they held them there demanding, Palestinian independence. They demanded people be released from prison. And to make matters worse, when German authorities attempted to go in and take out the hostage takers, it was completely botched. 11 athletes were shot and killed by these terrorists. Some, I believe, were even killed in the rescue attempt by authorities. 5 of the terrorists were killed. 3 survived. But shockingly, those 3 were actually released about a month later because another terrorist incident happened in which a German airliner had been held hostage by Palestinians who demanded the release of the earlier terrorists. Just a bad situation overall, and this would be one of the most shocking moments of the 20th century, and just a very sad. The Olympics are supposed to be something where politics are supposed to kind of get set aside for a few weeks, and that it just turned all about politics, and sadly people lost their lives as well. Now, the following year, we would have the next in these series of wars in between the Israelis and their Arab neighbors. In 1973, Egypt and Syria led an attack on Israel to try and retake the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the Golan Heights. The map you can see in the bottom right, excellent map. I want to highlight a couple different things here. Number one, what you see in kind of the almost a beige, kind of brownish tint there, that is held by Israel after the Six-Day War. So you can see all the land that they gain. Once again, we see another war in which, basically Israel has been attacked in this situation, but yet they've come out kind of the victors. They end up driving both of those Arab nations back and even taking more of their land. So the Yom Kippur War, which I did not mention, was launched on Yom Kippur, which is one of the holiest of holidays in the Jewish calendar. They're trying to kind of do a sneak attack where they thought most soldiers would be at home with their families celebrating, and it backfired. And in fact, both of those nations ended up losing more land as a result of this war. So another example to kind of drive a wedge between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In 1987, what would last for 6 years became known as the First Intifada. There was, of course, clashes ever since the establishment of Israel between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But in 1987, there were 4 Palestinians that were killed by Israeli soldiers, and Palestinians began to protest those killings. Not just through civil disobedience, but also through violence. Many of these protests did turn violent and into riots. You had Palestinians attacking Israeli military targets as well as civilian targets, which then resulted in an Israeli retaliation. Ultimately, 1,200 Palestinians would be killed and about 200 Israelis were killed. As a result of this first Intifada, you did have the establishment of Hamas, which I include because that is a very important group that we still hear a lot about today. Today it is not only considered a terrorist organization by the United States, but frankly, it's become the governing authority in places like the Gaza Strip. So when you hear of Hamas, that is the Palestinian fundamentalist group that was formed in response to this first Intifada and governs currently the Gaza Strip. Now, there would sadly be a second Intifada in 2000 that would last for about 5 years. This came after a failed peace negotiation, which we'll talk about later today, and a very divisive event in which the Prime Minister of Israel went to the Temple Mount, went to the Dome on the Rock, which is one of the holiest sites in all of Islam, which the Palestinians saw as a tremendous insult, that you would have this Jewish leader come to such a holy place in Islam. And as weapons had improved and all that, the killing was much deadlier. You had 3,000 Palestinians die and about 1,000 Israelis. And during this Intifada, it was not just protests and rioting. You also saw rocket attacks happening, where you would have, from Palestinian-controlled areas, you would have rockets being shot into Israeli towns and cities, and then Israelis would basically respond back. So all told, about 4,000 individuals would lose their lives in that second Intifada. Now, there have been major moments where peace was close to being had. They never last. In 1978, this was the closest we got early on. President Jimmy Carter held a peace summit for the nations of Israel and Egypt. At this point, no Arab nation had even recognized Israel as being a nation. Well, that's partly what Egypt agreed to in the Camp David Accords. They simply recognized Israel has a right to exist, that it is a nation, that they have a right to exist. In return, Israel gave back a lot of land that they had taken from Egypt, including basically parts of the West Bank. They agreed to allow the Palestinians some governing authority themselves in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I don't have it on here. I believe they regained access to Sinai during this as well. I could be wrong on that. But the result was, it looked as if, hey, we might actually have a peace deal worked out here. But then we saw the reaction among both Arab nations towards Israel, but also towards Egypt, and it even sparked an assassination. In 1981, the man pictured in the lower left-hand corner is the president of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat. And in 1981, he will be killed because of his recognition of Israel. There were a lot of extremists that were so angry that he would just simply agree that Israel had a right to exist that they literally killed him. And you can see in the bottom right, that was the beginning of a revolution that took place in Egypt. In fact, the man who would fill his role as president, Mubarak, was actually just removed within the last 10 years. He served as basically dictator of Egypt for the last about 30 years there. So the Camp David Accords, if it's going to follow a pattern that sadly we're going to see multiple times, in which it does look like we've made some progress towards peace, but ultimately someone ends up being assassinated that's kind of a ringleader. So again, another reason we often don't see too many peace negotiations in the Middle East here. In 1993, we tried it again. President Bill Clinton got Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, along with PLO leader Yasser Arafat, who we had just mentioned. So here you have the Israelis, the Palestinians coming together. And this really looks like a big. I remember this happening, and granted I was 10 years old at the time, but and not really in tune with geopolitics. But I remember this being such a really big deal that the Palestinians and Israelis agreed to something. Basically, Arafat recognized once again that Israel had a right to exist, and Israel agreed to give control of the Palestinian territories back to the Palestinians gradually. Both men, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, were both given the 1994 Nobel Peace Prize for their actions here. This was a great thing. This was the Oslo Accords, was a monumental moment. Yeah, that works. In which it looks like both sides are even closer to peace. But again, same sad thing that happens. In this case, it was the Israeli leader who was assassinated in 1995 by a radical Zionist, someone who did not want to negotiate with the Palestinians at all. He was an Israeli who felt that the land was given to them by God, that the Palestinians had no reason to be there, and killed Yitzhak Rabin in Tel Aviv for negotiating with the Palestinians. The problem in this story, okay? The overall problem are extremists. It's the extremists on both sides that don't want to recognize any kind of negotiation, that don't want to move an inch. It's people that are unwilling to sit down at the table and to recognize the value of the life of the other side. This is the problem on both sides of the conflict, but it's the extremists that constantly drive a wedge in between the moderate people that are trying to reach some kind of agreement. There's my soapbox. In 2000, they tried it once again, the Camp David Summit. It did not result in anything of note. In this case, Yasser Arafat was still representing the PLO. Israel this time did seem to give up a lot more. They were going to give up 91% of the control of the West Bank. They were going to give up the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and Arafat did not want it. Basically walked away, was refusing to negotiate here. So kind of a sad transition. 5 years earlier, it looked like Arafat might be open to this kind of deal, but by 2000, things had digressed enough that he walked away from the table. And sadly, well, I guess for Arafat, he would die within a few months of that. So the main voice of the PLO, the main voice of the Palestinians would be gone, and it made it even more difficult to negotiate any kind of settlement after that. Now, to wrap up today's lecture, we are going to take a look at four remaining issues, and these are still things that are driving a wedge in between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We're just going to look at four brief issues before we conclude. Number one, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, extremely diverse. It is kind of the epicenter of three of the world's major religions. You have Jews and Arabs, Palestinians, everyone that's living within this city. And to gain access to certain sites, I remember just even a few years ago, there had been some attacks in Jerusalem, and the Israelis cut off access to the Temple Mount. You can see there the golden dome on the rock. That is supposedly in Islamic faith, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. So obviously for Muslims, it's a very important site. The Israelis cut off access to that, and man, there was a major backlash of violence as a response. So Jerusalem will continue to be a center point of this conflict, and we're not seeing that go away anytime soon. I have to mention, I went to Israel a few years back, and I had a friend who was living there. And when I was in Jerusalem, there actually was a terror attack. A Palestinian had secured a big, basically bulldozer, was kind of driving through traffic, and thankfully he did not kill anyone, but security ended up having to jump in there, and they killed him. I had just been on that road about an hour before, so thankfully I avoided that terrorist incident. But Jerusalem will continue to be a major flashpoint moving forward, and that's not going away. That is something that is historically rooted in division, and frankly, even the United States last year under President Trump made the decision to move our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and that stoked a lot of anger among the Palestinians. Again, it's just a major center point of conflict. The second item, security concerns, and this is one that, as I'm recording here, the Palestinians and Israelis have just reached kind of a ceasefire, but over the last 2 weeks there have been major rocket attacks taking place between the two groups. But that has been happening for decades at this point. The Palestinians live behind, frankly, barbed wire and concrete walls. I remember when I went into the West Bank, I visited from Jerusalem. I went into the West Bank, and specifically I went to visit the city of Bethlehem. But I remember walking through the security and seeing these huge 20 feet concrete walls with razor wire on top, with graffiti on the sides, with bullet holes on the sides. And I remember the Israeli guard that was basically looking at my ID as I headed into the West Bank, the Palestinian-controlled area, and she said, "Don't be here after dark. Like, you need to come back. An American in the West Bank is probably not a good thing after dark." So this is still. There's a lot of issues here. I'm not trying to make light of it, because the Palestinians feel as if they are living in occupied territory, that the Israelis are keeping them behind these walls. Israelis fear the security attacks, the attacks on their security from Palestinian-controlled areas. You can see there over the last 20 years, there's been about 8,000 rockets that have gone from Palestine into Israel. And so, of course, there's this major security clash among the two groups. The third area that you might not think would be such a potential hazard, but that is the issue of water. Most nations get their water source, their major drinking water, from underground aquifers. There are large lakes under the ground that a lot of countries pump their water from, and that is definitely the case in Israel. You can see on the map, I'm sorry if it's a little pixelated, but there are two major aquifers located underneath the ground in Israel. Now, they just so happen to be existing underneath Palestinian-controlled areas. The one on the west, the Gaza Strip. The one on the east, you have the West Bank. So what has happened over the last few decades as water becomes a scarcer and scarcer natural resource is that the Israelis have not only pushed back the Palestinians to gain more access to land, but also to the source of water underneath that land. And in fact, they've, in some places, even come up with systems that dug at extreme angles underneath Palestinian-controlled areas to tap into that water. Now, this also becomes an issue once they get the water up, because the amount of water that is being that the Palestinians are allowed to gain access to has quite diminished over the years as it's become a more scarce resource. So this is, sadly, you wouldn't think in the 21st century that water would be such an issue, but it is. And frankly, Palestinians are finding themselves having less and less access to that water. The final issue is the Israeli settlements. And a settlement, frankly, it's just kind of a fancy way of referring to kind of encroaching neighborhoods. I want to refer you to the map down in the bottom right-hand corner. You can see there that, in 1945, before Israel is established, you can see there in green, that was the land that the Palestinians controlled. Of course, after Israel is established, that got cut down quite a bit. From 1949 on, you can see that the Palestinians are forced just into the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. But look at what has happened by 2000. Even the West Bank, which they had kind of been promised through negotiation, there have been further and further encroachments into the West Bank with neighborhoods that look like the picture in the bottom left. I went into one of these settlements. I visited one just to see what it was like in a Palestinian-controlled area, but it was all Israeli Jews that inhabited this neighborhood, and it's kind of strange. I mean, you go into these neighborhoods that are just, frankly, in many ways, just like American neighborhoods. I mean, just, apartment buildings and houses, but yet to think that there's so much conflict about, it being there. Now, on the Jewish side, the Israelis feel as if this land is theirs, that they've both won the land, but it was also given to them by God. But the Palestinians are angry because any agreement they've had with the Israelis, of course, it's been encroached on further and further. And, over the last few decades, there's been over 500,000 Israeli settlers come into what was supposed to be reserved for Palestinians. And like I said, I wish I need to have a current map, but you would see that land has diminished even further at this point. So this will remain a major issue in Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hopefully they can work out an agreement, but both sides have to be willing to sit down at the table together before that happens, and frankly, I'm just not seeing that happening anytime soon. Guys, that'll do it for today. Thank you so much for paying attention to today's lecture. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks.